It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, for a character with the marquee power that could rival just about any other character in the history of film, it's a little bit of a surprise that today's featured movie, 1943's Son of Dracula, was only the third film in the Universal Dracula franchise over the course of 12 years. By 1943, Frankenstein already had 5 films, one of which also served as the second of the brand new Wolfman franchise. The Mummy had its 4th film in production, and Invisible Agent had already marked the 4th film in the Invisible Man franchise. But Dracula, the first of the Universal classic horror films to be released, and one of the main faces of the Universal Classic Monsters franchise that they sell the images off to all over the place, particularly when it starts getting to the fall weather every year and people prepare for Halloween season. But this character would only have 3 films in his corner of the Universal Universe. Okay, yes, I know you might ask about House of Frankenstein or House of Dracula. I hear you, but hear me out on this. He's only a part of those films. In fact, he's actually dispatched rather early in both films, to the point that he kind of comes off as just a character to add to the poster and less of a leading character. And if that explanation doesn't satisfy you, I mean, look at it like saying that no one calls any of the 4 Avengers films from Marvel an Iron Man or Captain America or Thor movie. No, they are in those movies, but those are Marvel films for the Avengers, not a movie that Cap or Thor or Iron Man stands out on their own. No, Thor has 4 films, Iron Man has 3 films, and Cap is about to get his 4th. So when they come together, those are Avengers films. But I digress. I think there are a couple of reasons why Dracula was not often brought back like the Wolfman or Frankenstein's monster were. One reason that is more behind the scenes was that Bram Stoker's family held the Dracula rights pretty closely. There's the whole thing about how they didn't approve of Nosferatu in 1922, and therefore it needed to be hastily rewritten to change names and so forth on the cards for the silent film. That might have made Universal leery to continue to use the character. Now, the other big reason is that that is apparent right on the screen in the original 1931 Dracula is, well, he died. He was staked and killed. When Universal was being a little more serious about their films in the early days, it would seem hard to convince anybody that they conceived a way to bring a character like that back without writing some sort of fantastical way that he could be resurrected from a pretty final fate that he suffered. That's why in 1936, Dracula's Daughter, a direct sequel to Dracula, yes, including the aftermath, which finds Professor Van Helsing being arrested and questioned for killing the Count, does not bring him back and focuses on another character who still kind of has that charismatic and interesting presence. Dracula's Daughter, in the end, becomes one of the more fascinating entries in the Universal Classic Monster series. But by 1943, Universal was kind of dropping the guise of wanting to make really serious horror films. The only films after 1939's Son of Frankenstein that I believe take themselves absolutely seriously are The Wolfman and the color version they made of The Phantom of the Opera. Most of the other films released by the studio, particularly the ones in the 40s, were sequels that were starting to show a lot of wear and diminishing returns at the box office, and also in terms of creativity and quality. So why not bring back Dracula at this point? In 1942, Universal assigned the writing of a new Dracula sequel script to none other than Kurt Siodmak, who wrote a ton of Universal's monster movies in the 40s. But here's where things get really interesting in the story of the behind-the-scenes stuff regarding Son of Dracula. Kurt's brother, Robert Siodmak, was hired as director. This move caused Robert to force Kurt to leave the project. Kurt in the cast is listed as only a story by, and he probably provided a little bit more scripting than just providing a story by. But yeah, Robert Siodmak didn't so much fire his brother and scriptwriter of this film, Kurt, but forced him just to leave. You see, there was a pretty terrible sibling rivalry between the two brothers. When they lived in Germany, Robert had a magazine that Kurt wrote for. In order to get his stories published, Kurt had to publish his articles under a pseudonym. Robert was notorious for wanting only one Siodmak around anything that he ever did. And that's kind of crazy. Kurt would later say to his brother, that this movie was well made and could have been a real classic because of how Robert could set the mood and the atmosphere through the use of light and shadows. That is one of the really positive things about this movie, is that it does look great. But according to Kurt, Robert could make fantastic scenes, but he just wasn't a writer like Kurt was. Now, this movie is truly a sequel to 1931's Dracula. Yes, the Count was destroyed in the 19th century. However, the idea around this movie was to focus more on the demonic ghoulishness of the concept of an immortal vampire. So the idea of traditions and superstitions would be what brings Dracula back to life and keeps him alive. It's more metaphysical of an idea, I suppose, and there is something else very metaphysical that I'll talk about later about this movie. Now, as for the casting, of course, it's Lon Chaney Jr. Chaney played almost every monster found on anything that was produced with the picture of the Universal Classic Monsters on them. Now, he didn't play the creature from the Black Lagoon, as that came much later, and naturally, he didn't play the Bride of Frankenstein either. However, he originated Larry Talbot, aka the Wolfman. He then went on to play Karras the Mummy. He played the Frankenstein monster once in The Ghost of Frankenstein, and he played Count Dracula, Alucard, which is what he is known through a pretty big chunk of this movie as. But before I get into the movie, I do want to say that every time I hear the name Alucard, which is used a lot in this movie, aside from, knowing what that name is if you spell it backwards, I immediately think of one of my all-time favorite video games ever, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Around the time that I was really digging into the Universal Classics, I was about 20 years old or so. I was also spending a lot of time playing Symphony of the Night. I would play the game sitting on the end of my bed with the TV in front of me, and I would play so late at night because it was such an immersive game. It was a long game to play. But my cat at the time, Neelix, would put his paws on my shoulders and stand up and kind of nibble at my hair because he wanted me to go to bed, where he would usually sleep right above the top of my head on my pillow. And that was always a signal to me that it was time to stop playing the game as Alucard, the Son of Dracula, and finally get some shut-eye. So in this movie, Count Alucard has come to the United States, and he's been invited to a New Orleans plantation by Catherine Caldwell. Now, Alucard is not on the train that arrives, but a lot of boxes with his crest were on that train. Kay Caldwell is kind of a spooky chick. She talks to her sister Claire about how she believes in telepathy and all sorts of metaphysical and mystical stuff. And Kay goes to see Queen Zimba, a fortune teller who tells her that Count Alucard is not his name and that he must be stopped before death comes. And she also sees Kay marrying a corpse. Just then, she's attacked and killed by a bat. So now, understand that Kay has met Alucard when she visited Europe. Her love interest, Frank, says that she's been different ever since going there, and all this weirdo supernatural stuff has changed her. In fact, she doesn't seem all that sad about this Queen Zimba being killed right in front of her, and somebody that she's taken up a lot of meetings with since coming back from Europe. But Frank even found out that Count Alucard, whoever he is is a fraud. He called some embassies overseas and tried to figure out more about him, and yeah, he's not really who he says he is. Now soon, Alucard makes his appearance, but not at the reception where he was to be introduced by Kay. Instead, he creeps into the room of Colonel Caldwell, Kay and Claire's father. Soon, the colonel's found dead from an apparent heart failure, and Claire in the will gets all of her father's money while Kay gets the plantation, which is appropriately named Dark Oaks. Dr. Harry Brewster, a friend of the Caldwells, has been in contact with a Hungarian doctor named Dr. Laszlo, and Brewster tries to find out about Alucard, which he has figured out is Dracula backwards. And Laszlo says no sane person would impersonate Dracula, so he should be very careful of this Alucard character. Not only does Brewster have the warning from Dr. Laszlo, but Claire also thinks something is wrong with Alucard and how her sister is now acting. And so Brewster says Claire needs to leave the plantation and go back to town for safety. And he's going to try to convince Kay to leave Dark Oaks as well. And if she doesn't leave, he wants Claire to make a plea of insanity with him for Kay. But one night, Kay goes to meet Alucard, who is sleeping in a coffin in a marsh. And she's been enthralled by him ever since meeting him in Europe. And she convinced her father to change his will to leave her with the estate so that they could both have a place to live once they married, which they do that very night that we first see the two of them meet. So let's drop the facade, shall we? I mean, the reason why Dracula has come to America and why he wanted to be in New Orleans specifically is that it's much different than his homeland. It's vibrant and green and warm and full of younger life and, as he says, a younger race of people who aren't as superstitious to protect themselves from a vampire. And as he is about to feed from Kay, Frank arrives distraught over Kay breaking up with him. He sees Alucard there and basically tells Alucard to get lost. But the vampire attacks Frank and throws him across the room. So Frank pulls out a gun and tries to shoot Alucard. But Kay, who hid behind her new husband, well, she's the one who falls to the ground dead because the bullets pass through Alucard. Frank flees and collapses in the family cemetery, and Alucard was going to feed upon him, but a glow of a cross forces him to retreat. Now, after Frank comes to, he goes to Dr. Brewster's place and tells him about what happened. So Brewster decides to go to Dark Oaks, already kind of suspecting that things aren't quite what they seem when it comes to Alucard and Kay and all of that. And there he's met by Alucard, who shows him that Kay is alive and seemingly quite healthy. Kay and Alucard say they wish to be left alone as Alucard is involved in scientific research that will take up all of the daylight hours. They have no desire to see anyone, even Claire, and especially not Frank. While Brewster was checking in on Kay, Frank turned himself in for the murder of Kay, but Brewster tries to help clear his name. The sheriff takes Frank and Brewster to Dark Oaks to figure out the truth. Looking around, the sheriff goes into a crypt where he finds Kay's lifeless body in a coffin. Now, the sheriff thinks that Brewster might have been an accessory in this murder because, while it's possible that he went to Dark Oaks overnight to try to hide the body, but that means the clock is kind of ticking for Brewster to figure out how to deal with Alucard. Good news is that Laszlo has arrived in New Orleans to help out. And Alucard appears to them and attempts to kill Brewster, but Laszlo drives him off with a cross. And after Alucard leaves, a woman brings her son into Brewster's doctor's office, and the child has a vampire bite on his neck, which to which Laszlo is basically says, well, this is really starting pretty quick around here. I should also mention that Laszlo is played by J. Edward Bromberg, who we talked about being blacklisted in 1950. I talked about him last week because he was also in The Invisible Agent, too, as the kind of wormy Nazi guy that was in that one. But anyway, So we have Frank in a jail cell waiting to be, formally incarcerated and tried for murder. Meanwhile, Kay is in the morgue, transported there by the cops in her coffin, which I guess is pretty nice of them, I suppose, because if they didn't, I think she would have burned up in the daylight, but whatever. Brewster and Laszlo need to locate Alucard's resting place and destroy him within it. They know they need to also destroy Kay too. Now they hope they can make that easy by having Claire order her cremation immediately. However, that's going to be tough because that night she goes to visit Frank in his cell and explains that she married Alucard simply to gain immortality and she wants to share it with Frank. Now, Kay reveals to Frank that Alucard is indeed Count Dracula. However, she does have plans to double-cross her new husband because she's always been in love with Frank. And she wants to make Frank immortal like she is, and then would like for him to destroy Dracula so that they can live forever. And when Kay learns that the plan is to cremate her body, she says that they may also have to eliminate both Claire and Dr. Brewster for getting in her way, which really kind of tips Frank off that Kay is no longer the person he knew, that she is certainly cursed at this point. And Kay tells Frank that she can help him escape and will wait for him at Dark Oaks. And she tells him where he will find Dracula to destroy him. But the only thing is, he really cannot get to the Dracula's coffin until after daylight. But after Frank escapes, Brewster and Laszlo bring the sheriff along so that they can explain what's going on and try to help Frank because they think he needs protection against Alucard. And that's true. He's going to need it because he does get to Dracula before the sun comes up. However, Frank is smart enough to set Dracula's coffin on fire, basically destroying his only place that he can get to for rest before the sun rises. Dracula attempts to kill Frank, but it's too late. The sun rises and Dracula disintegrates. When Laszlo, Brewster, and the cops go to find Frank inside the Dark Oaks plantation house, they see that he's already lit Kay's coffin on fire, knowing that the love of his life died long ago. So let's talk about the three things that I like about Son of Dracula. First, I really like the Frank character. He's actually fairly tragic. Frank has been in love with Kay for most of their lives, and she has changed since going over to Europe and met Alucard. Off-screen, he's discarded for Alucard, and he's really distraught about it. So much so that he's carrying a gun with him. And after Alucard throttles him and tosses him across a room, all Frank can think to do is to shoot the man who took his love. However, that kills Kay, which then gives Alucard what he wanted anyway, the ability to turn her into a vampire, which he does. And at this point, Frank is never going to get her back. This isn't the usual Universal horror film. Usually the young hero saves the girl from the monster, but it was already too late before the movie even started. She had already met and got enthralled by Dracula, and he was already on his way to America. Without anyone knowing that Alucard is actually a fabled vampire named Dracula, it was just simply too late. And then Frank has to basically destroy her too. It's a good twist on the typical formula seen in these movies, and it makes Frank a little bit more tragic than the typical hero character. Second, I like that this movie gets a little meta. Throughout this movie, Brewster, trying to better understand what he's dealing with, is reading the book Dracula. I mean, it's the real book, too, so it kind of connects back to the original text and sets the 1931 movie as the content of the original book. And I thought that was a nice touch, including that in this movie to kind of help more closely tie that into this kind of far-off sequel, if you will. Third, this might be something of an unpopular opinion, but I think Lon Chaney Jr. could have been a really good Dracula. Unfortunately, anyone who plays Dracula has to be kind of caught in between the powerhouses that were Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee. I think Gary Oldman was fine in the 92 version. John Carradine could have been a pretty good Dracula if he had better movies to be in. But Lon Chaney Jr. Sometimes gets the short end of the stick. Now, if I'm being honest, I'm not sure the script was really right for him. most of the dialogue feels a little stilted. However, I do think he looks good as Dracula. He does have the imposing stare that he uses to back down Frank a couple of times in this movie. He does seem stronger and more powerful than the others in the movie, and that probably owes a great deal to his height and his general physique that made him at times a rough and tumble type of actor. And I do like that he says I do like one line here that he says quite a bit, and I think he did it relatively well. When Frank goes near the end of the movie to destroy Dracula, Frank comes out of the drainage area that his coffin is in, and Dracula says something to the effect of, "It's not common for my enemies to accommodate me," meaning, hey, I needed to destroy you anyway, and here you are, you came to me. That's great. That's a good line, and Chaney says it pretty well in the movie. And I feel like if the Dracula's lines were written a little bit more modern and a lot less poetic, Chaney could have been a really good fit for this role. But that said, at least he does look right as Dracula. And if you were to watch this movie without sound, you'd see that he probably really was the right choice for this, despite Universal kind of shoehorning him in, basically into all of their monster movies at the time after The Wolfman hit big. If only he had a little bit more relaxed dialogue, I think he could have been a really, really good Dracula and could have reprised the role a few more times. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. And don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky so that you can be notified when new things drop. And you can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. You know what? Let's stick with Lon Chaney Jr. for a couple of more weeks. How's that sound? Over the next 2 weeks, Monster Mondays will bury the Universal Mummy series as Lon Chaney Jr. plays Karis the Mummy for the final 2 films in that series. So first up, join me as we get haunted by the mummy's ghost. Until next week, stay spooky.